In our series of pre-election segments, we turn to a candidate running next year. She's a political theorist, social entrepreneur, and policy innovator. Before her campaign, she was a professor at Harvard University and director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. We'd like to welcome a Democratic candidate for governor, Danielle Allen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. It's good to be here.
Danielle, some of the people who've been following you lately see a nice fit between your candidacy and the urgency around the pandemic and our hopes for recovery. But tell me the backstory about your life here. Which came first? Was it the urgency or was it your own vision about what politics should mean?
Well, the truth is, I've been committed to democracy for my whole life. It's kind of an inherited commitment. I come from a family with a deep tradition of working on behalf of democracy. So great-grandparents on my mom's side who fought for women's right to vote in the early 20th century in Michigan. And my granddad founded one of the first NAACP chapters in Northern Florida in the 40s, which was a very dangerous thing to do. So I have this family tradition of working for democracy. And I've always worked outside of universities in issue advocacy, campaigning. I was a regional field organizer in the 07-08 Obama campaign. And then it all got very personal in 2009, which is the year I lost my baby cousin, Michael. So Michael was probably the first baby I ever held when he was born in 1979. And then 15 years later in 1994, he was arrested on a first arrest in Southern California for an attempted carjacking. He served 12 years on that first arrest. And then when he got out, I was what I always call cousin on duty, trying to help with housing and school and jobs. I'll never forget sitting with Michael in a hot car on a hot summer's day, weeks after his release, looking at a map, trying to figure out how to put the pieces of a life together again. The only job that would consider him was in one place and then miles away in another direction. The only community college with a path forward for him. And miles away in a third direction, the only place with affordable housing, public transportation in between slow and unreliable. I had this feeling of dread in my bones. How are these pieces going to come together? For Michael, they didn't in the end come together. And he was killed 2 years after he was first released by somebody he met while he was in prison. So that was a life turning point moment for me. And I really dug in and started asking the question of how on earth can we put the infrastructure in place so that people have access to the pieces of a livable life. I started working on justice reform. That led to work on democracy reform. And then when the pandemic hit, I had the same sense of dread, watching folks get pushed back to work without access to testing and PPE. It didn't seem right that some places, the MBA, my incredible university, could build bubbles for themselves and others were going without protection. So I jumped in again, I organized, pulled together experts and practitioners, mayors and community advocates, and we put together the first national policy roadmap advocating for a real ramp up of public investment in testing and contact tracing. But it was that same basic sense of the pieces of a livable life, of access to security and opportunity, they're just not here for some people. And we have to jump in and organize and change that.
Your cousin paid a price for making a really bad decision at a very young age. I think it was like maybe 15 or 16.
Exactly.
He should have eventually been able to turn the corner and do better. Why didn't that happen? And what does that mean about policy here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, there are a couple of different pieces of it. One is something about juvenile justice, in all honesty. Juvenile justice really should be about making sure that people are connected to the resources of education, to social supports, mental health supports, behavioral health supports, violence prevention, interruption supports, and the like. All of those kinds of tools that really do help people put their life on another course. Michael didn't have access to that. That is not how the justice system was working in the 90s, for sure. We've made good progress in starting to reform juvenile justice, but we do still have further work to do. And here in Massachusetts, we have really significant disparities where young people of different backgrounds, sort of white kids versus kids of color, for the same behavior really do end up in very different places. And it's very clear that if you can keep kids from coming into contact with the justice system itself at that early point, they'll be on a different trajectory. They won't end up trapped in the world of the criminal justice system. So that's a key area where I think we have work to do.
When the pandemic struck, a lot of people, even governors and mayors, they couldn't rely on the playbook to figure out what to do. And you were one of the people who came out with a new playbook. You worked with people on that in a collaboration, but at the same time, people say, were those just good ideas? Some of which actually look pretty sound now, but at the same time, what was your contribution to making a difference in the urgent response at that point?
Sure. Well, when the pandemic first hit, I reached out to Ezekiel Emanuel, who is a person who has been now on President Biden's COVID response task force. And he's a very distinguished bioethicist. He's a friend. And I reached out and said, look, it's clear people are struggling. There's ethics issues in what we're facing. What's the biggest problem that somebody with my background in ethicists could help with? And he said, look, we're really struggling to figure out how to deal with what looks like a trade-off between protecting health and protecting the economy. We really need help thinking about that. So I did what I always do when I face a big problem, which is I reach out to the full network of people I know who have relevant expertise. So I reached out to health people, I reached out to economists, I reached out to other philosophers, I reached out to policy people, I reached out to mayors, and we started chewing on the problem. And it was just very quickly clear that the whole framework was wrong. There was not a trade-off. To protect health was to protect the economy, and we had to protect the economy to protect health. People can't live healthy lives if they don't have an economy sustaining them at the end of the day. And the other thing that became very clear really fast was that other countries had actually already figured out the solution. So we didn't actually have to invent anything. We just had to be open to learning from others. So we took lessons from South Korea, from Australia, from Taiwan, from other democratic countries that were successfully fighting the coronavirus back in January, February, and March. That's what led to our argument that we really needed to accelerate public investment in testing and contact tracing and supports for people to isolate. We never quite got there in this country. People really needed that paid time off. They needed nutrition. They needed access to food delivered to their home in order to be able to isolate. This was especially true for working people. So some of the communities that were hit the hardest, we could definitely have supported much better if we had honestly just been willing to learn faster from other countries.
Well, a year and a half later, we have a housing crisis that seems to be getting worse between people struggling to pay rent and the way prices are going, especially in the neighborhoods of Boston faced with gentrification. What would you do for them?
Thanks a lot. No, I think this is a moment, again, for all of us recognizing that we have a Commonwealth-wide problem and we need a Commonwealth-wide commitment to addressing it. We need every municipality and region in our Commonwealth to commit to increasing the degree of affordable housing in that place. That is about building strategic plans to achieve that. There are different tools for doing this. To some extent, we should be making more use of as-of-right zoning overlays for auxiliary dwelling units. People have been talking a lot about that. Even for three-unit home, buildings, the sort of tiers structures and the like. But different parts of our Commonwealth could select different solutions from a menu of options. And what we really need is to invest. The state needs to invest in having municipalities and regions go ahead and do that strategic planning to lay out the commitments they can make to increasing affordable housing in their area. So lots of places are working hard. Boston is starting to work really hard on this issue for sure. And we see people in Pembroke working hard on this issue. We see people trying to add affordable housing on Martha's Vineyard. We see people in Western Mass forming collaboratives to work on this. Some parts of our Commonwealth are not so engaged yet. And so we really need our state government to ensure that everybody steps up, commits to developing a strategic plan to increase affordable housing in that city or region.
One of the other things that people are going to be looking at, of course, are the other options, even just within the Democratic primary, because we know of two people already running. They've been in the legislature. They both have strong progressive credentials. There's still the expectation maybe Attorney General Maura Healey would jump in. So you're competing against people like that. They have this experience in one part of state government or another. Why would you, as a bit more of an outsider to that, be a better pick?
Well, thank you for that. So I have leadership experience in the nonprofit sector over the last 20 years at all scales. So started off early as a 32-year-old dean of a division in a university with 250 full-time employees and $60 million annual budget, tiny compared to our state, but not a small job for a 32-year-old. And my leadership experiences have built from there. And they're executive experiences, they're managerial experiences. And at the end of the day, this isn't a legislative job. And that's something that we should all keep front and center. It's a governance job. So I've had the great privilege and fortune to be able to build up those skills of governance, of building teams, of managing through process, of working through committee structures to drive to results and completion.
Finally, what this pandemic has done lately is it has shown what's been called the fragility of goodness. You probably heard that term from another book, perhaps. It's a tough thing to get through, and we have to worry about how people in this country and this state get along. What do you see doing about that?
Thank you so much for that question. You have just named what is absolutely my top priority. At the end of the day, I think the most important thing we have to do in this Commonwealth is rebuild a sense of commitment to one another. Our ability to solve our policy programs, our policy problems, excuse me, really flows from whether or not we have that underlying sense of commitment to one another. I think we have to do that work at all levels. We have to have encouraged communities to work on knitting themselves together. Worcester is an amazing example where they really pulled together in the pandemic. They built an organization called Worcester Together that brought a lot of different stakeholders together to really think about how to address problems in the community. That's the spirit we need to see all over the Commonwealth. We see a lot of it all over the Commonwealth. People really did come together. Now the question is, can we take that new sense of commitment to each other and make it durable, make it sustainable, so that we really can tackle our hardest, most significant shared problems?